On December 25, 2024, Russia announced the freezing of U.S. assets within its borders, escalating tensions in the ongoing standoff between the two nations. This unprecedented move is a direct response to years of sanctions imposed by the United States and its allies, signaling that Moscow is adopting a more assertive strategy in its financial warfare against the West. The announcement has caused shockwaves in global financial markets, prompting businesses and governments to scramble in an attempt to understand the broader implications of Russia's actions. The U.S. and its European allies now face an urgent question. What does this mean for the global financial system? And what vulnerabilities are exposed about their own positions? For years, the West has relied on its dominance of global financial systems to impose its will, leveraging control over the dollar and SWIFT network. However, Russia's move underscores a diminishing grip of the West as emerging powers like Russia and China gain increasing economic and strategic leverage. The West's approach, exemplified by relentless sanctions on Russia since the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the 2022 war in Ukraine, has pushed Moscow to diversify its economic partnerships, particularly with China and other BRICS nations. Russia's actions are not merely retaliatory. They are a calculated maneuver that reveals cracks in the Western-led global order. Over the past year, the EU and US have struggled to maintain their economic dominance, as more nations turn to alternative financial systems, including those based on the Chinese yuan or regional currencies. The freezing of US assets marks a critical shift. The West's efforts to isolate Russia have backfired, forcing Moscow to build resilience against Western economic pressures and prompting other nations to question their reliance on dollar-dominated systems. Europe's role in this unfolding crisis cannot be overlooked. By aligning blindly with Washington's punitive measures, the EU has not only compromised its own economic interests, but also alienated potential allies. European industries, already struggling with the energy crisis worsened by sanctions on Russia, now face an uncertain future as Moscow strengthens its alliances with Asia. Meanwhile, European leaders continue to project unity, even as their economies buckle under the strain of their policies. Critics argue that the EU's blind adherence to American dictates has reduced it to a geopolitical pawn, unable to assert its own strategic autonomy. For the United States, the implications are profound. While the freezing of assets might seem symbolic, it sets a dangerous precedent. If other nations begin adopting similar tactics, the U.S. could face a significant erosion of its financial hegemony. Moreover, this move is likely to accelerate the global trend toward de-dollarization, as nations seek to protect themselves from potential U.S. overreach. Washington's increasing reliance on sanctions as a blanket solution to international disputes has led to significant pushback. Russia's latest move serves as a stark reminder that these tactics come with unintended consequences. In this new era of multipolarity, the West must face the reality that its unilateral actions are no longer uncontested. Russia's decision to freeze U.S. assets is not merely a retaliatory act, it is a declaration that the rules of the game are changing. The question now is whether the U.S. and its allies can adapt to this shift or continue down a path of diminishing returns, clinging to strategies that no longer hold the power they once did. As 2025 approaches, it's clear that the West's dominance is under siege, not solely from external threats, but from the consequences of its own hubris. To understand the current situation between Russia and the U.S., one must trace the roots of this conflict back to the dramatic escalation of financial warfare following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. In a landmark decision, the U.S. and its allies froze approximately $300 billion in Russian foreign assets held within Western financial institutions. This freeze, hailed as one of the most severe economic punishments in modern history, aimed to cripple Moscow's ability to fund its war efforts and send a clear message that territorial aggression would not go unpunished. However, the West's ultimate goal was not only punitive but strategic, to divert these frozen funds to support Ukraine's reconstruction. Yet the decision raised serious questions about the legal and ethical precedent it set. The U.S. government, through the use of the Reinforcing Economic Protections Act, laid the groundwork for seizing Russian state assets to benefit Ukraine. But such actions are far more complicated than they appear. The process involves significant legal hurdles, including obtaining coordination from G7 and EU allies, navigating a complex web of international legal frameworks, and dealing with challenges posed by private entities and sovereign immunity laws. Russia has viewed these measures as outright theft, using the incident as propaganda to bolster its narrative of Western duplicity and lawlessness. Moscow argues that the freezing of assets undermines trust in the global financial system, particularly among nations outside the Western Bloc. This sentiment resonates with countries in the global South and emerging economies, many of which harbor historical grievances against Western dominance. The asset freeze has now set the stage for a fundamental shift in the balance of global financial power. The decision to freeze Russian assets, initially celebrated as a bold move, has revealed growing divisions within the Western alliance. Countries in the European Union, particularly those with deep economic ties to Russia, have expressed concerns about the long-term effects of these measures on global financial stability. The controversy surrounding the frozen assets goes beyond geopolitics, sparking debates in the US and Europe about the limits of governmental authority over foreign-held assets. Legal experts caution that arbitrarily converting these funds into usable resources for Ukraine could set a dangerous precedent. Today it's Russia. Tomorrow it could be any other country. Such actions risk eroding the trust that supports the global financial system, with repercussions far beyond the immediate conflict. Critics also highlight the hypocrisy of the West. The US and its allies have long condemned other nations, especially China, for weaponizing economic tools such as trade restrictions and currency manipulation. Yet the West's willingness to seize foreign assets for political purposes mirrors these very tactics, blurring the line between enforcing international norms and exerting raw power. For many observers, this double standard undermines the moral high ground claimed by the US and the EU, making it harder for them to rally global support. The growing mistrust has led nations like China, India, and Brazil to explore alternatives to the Western-dominated financial system. The rise of the BRICS bloc and the increasing use of non-dollar currencies in international trade are direct consequences of the West's over-reliance on financial sanctions. Russia, in particular, has accelerated its pivot towards these alternative frameworks, strengthening ties with China and other like-minded partners. Moscow has also worked to create self-sufficient financial systems, increasing the use of the ruble in trade agreements and diversifying its foreign reserves away from dollar-denominated assets. While the US and its allies argue that freezing Russian assets is justified due to the scale of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the broader question remains: at what cost? The global financial system is based on trust and predictability, and any disruption to this balance could have far-reaching consequences. Nations may begin to question the safety of holding assets in Western institutions, fearing that geopolitical disputes could make their holdings vulnerable. Russia's retaliatory freeze on US assets is part of this broader shift, signaling a change in the rules of engagement. As the US grapples with the implications of its policies, it faces a world that is increasingly fragmented. The West's strategy, aimed at isolating Moscow, risks isolating itself from a world that is growing weary of unipolar dominance. This financial tit-for-tat could also have unintended consequences for Ukraine. While the asset freeze was intended to secure funding for its recovery, the prolonged legal and political battles over the frozen funds have delayed tangible support. With each passing month, the promise of utilizing these assets to rebuild Ukraine becomes less feasible, as doubts grow over whether the funds will ever be released in a usable form. This delay is not just a failure of execution, but a symptom of broader dysfunction within the Western alliance. The freezing of assets, whether by the West or Russia, has opened a Pandora's box of legal, economic, and political challenges. What was once considered an unshakable financial system is now being tested in ways that seemed unimaginable just a few years ago. The real question is not just how this chapter will end, but what kind of world will emerge in its aftermath. At the heart of the issue is trust, an essential pillar of the international monetary order. The US dollar has long enjoyed dominance as the world's reserve currency, bolstered by its perceived stability and predictability. However, critics warn that weaponizing financial systems against Russia could erode this trust. Think tanks like the Heritage Foundation have cautioned that such actions may set a dangerous precedent, undermining US dollar supremacy and accelerating efforts by other nations to diversify away from dollar-denominated reserves. One of the immediate risks is the potential destabilization of the global financial system. The dominance of the dollar has historically provided the US with unique advantages, such as the ability to impose sanctions effectively and borrow at lower costs. Yet the seizure of foreign assets sends a clear message to other nations. Holding reserves in dollars or Western financial institutions may no longer be safe from geopolitical pressures. This perception is particularly damaging at a time when countries like China and members of the BRICS bloc are actively challenging the dollar's dominance by promoting alternative currencies and payment systems. The consequences extend beyond geopolitics. Central banks worldwide, observing the treatment of Russian assets, may begin diversifying their foreign reserves to reduce exposure to the dollar. This trend could lower demand for US Treasury bonds, leading to higher borrowing costs for Washington and potentially contributing to inflationary pressures in the US economy. A shift away from the dollar could fragment the global financial system. creating inefficiencies and vulnerabilities as alternative currencies and payment networks compete for dominance. Moscow's response to the asset freeze has further complicated the situation. Russia has hinted at retaliatory measures, including freezing foreign investments within its borders. This potential countermeasure could escalate tensions and have severe repercussions for European financial institutions, with Euroclear, a major European depository for securities transactions, being particularly vulnerable. Reports suggest that Russia's actions could lead to significant losses for Euroclear, possibly pushing it toward bankruptcy. The collapse of such a critical institution would send shockwaves through European financial markets, destabilizing the region's already fragile economic recovery. The broader consequences for Europe cannot be ignored. The European Union's alignment with Washington's aggressive financial policies has exposed its economies to increasing risks. European banks and businesses, many with substantial investments in Russia, now face an uncertain future. The threat of asset freezes and retaliatory actions has already weakened investor confidence, triggering capital flight and reducing foreign direct investment in the region. Meanwhile, industries reliant on Russian markets or resources are grappling with the long-term consequences of severed economic ties. For the United States, the risks are not limited to external threats, but are also deeply rooted in domestic issues. The reliance on sanctions and asset seizures as tools of foreign policy marks a shift toward coercive economic strategies. While these measures may be effective in the short term, they risk undermining the very systems they aim to protect. Critics argue that the U.S. has become overly dependent on the dollar's dominance, failing to account for the global backlash its actions may provoke. As more countries explore alternatives to the dollar, Washington could find itself struggling to maintain its financial influence. The situation also reignites debates over the ethical and legal dimensions of asset seizures. While the U.S. justifies its actions as a necessary response to Russia's aggression, skeptics question the long-term impact of such unilateral decisions. Seizing state-owned assets, particularly when used in third-party conflicts, challenges the principles of sovereign immunity and could result in prolonged legal battles in international courts. Furthermore, the perception of double standards, punishing adversaries while overlooking the transgressions of allies, has further eroded Washington's moral authority. These developments are occurring against a backdrop of broader geopolitical changes. The rise of China, the expansion of BRICS, and the growing assertiveness of countries in the global south have collectively weakened the West's ability to dictate terms unilaterally. Russia's asset freeze, though provocative, is part of a larger trend where nations are increasingly resisting Western dominance. For these countries, the U.S. and its allies' treatment of Russian assets serves as a cautionary tale, underscoring the urgency of diversifying their economic and financial dependencies. As the global order becomes more fragmented, the question remains whether the U.S. and its allies are prepared to adapt. Washington's ability to navigate this complex landscape will depend on its willingness to balance economic tools with the need to preserve the trust and cooperation that sustain the international system. Currently, the freezing of Russian assets serves as a powerful symbol of both the West's resolve and the vulnerabilities it faces in an increasingly multipolar world. If these trends continue unchecked, the consequences could be profound. The preeminence of the U.S. dollar, the stability of Western financial institutions, and the cohesion of the global economy are all at risk. Whether the West recalibrates its approach or doubles down on its current course will shape not only the outcome of this financial confrontation, but also the future of the global economic order itself. The European Union's strategy in its economic confrontation with Russia has been marked by inconsistency and hesitation, raising serious concerns about its effectiveness and commitment to collective action. While EU leaders have consistently condemned Russia's actions and aligned with the US in freezing assets, the bloc has stopped short of formally seizing these funds. This gap between rhetoric and action has created divisions within the EU, weakening its credibility and highlighting the challenges of maintaining unity among its diverse member states. Countries such as Germany and Hungary, with stronger economic ties to Russia, have often opposed measures seen as overly aggressive, signaling disarray within the EU's decision-making processes. One of the EU's central weaknesses lies in its historical reliance on Russian energy. For years, Europe depended heavily on Russian oil and gas imports, which not only funded Moscow's economy, but also gave the Kremlin significant leverage over European policies. Even after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the EU's responses were delayed and fragmented as member states weighed the economic costs of severing these energy ties. While dependence has decreased in recent years, it remains a critical vulnerability that Russia could exploit in future geopolitical conflicts. The energy crisis that followed sanctions on Russian energy exports further exposed the EU's lack of preparation. driving up costs for households and businesses across Europe as countries scrambled for alternative supplies. The long-term effects of this dependency extend beyond energy. Europe's reluctance to act decisively in seizing Russian assets reflects deeper fears of economic repercussions, especially for member states with significant trade and financial exposure to Moscow. This caution has undermined the EU's ability to present a unified and strong response to Russian aggression, eroding its standing as a geopolitical actor and raising doubts about its capacity to confront future crises. From a legal and ethical perspective, the West's approach to frozen assets is fraught with complications. While freezing assets is relatively straightforward under international law, transferring ownership or outright confiscating these assets is far more contentious. In the US, such actions would require circumventing foreign sovereign immunity, a legal principle that protects state-owned assets from seizure. Legal scholars argue that confiscating these funds without due process could violate international law and undermine the norms the West claims to uphold. The implications of these actions go beyond the immediate conflict. If the US and its allies proceed with seizing Russian assets, they risk setting a dangerous global precedent. Nations around the world, particularly those outside the Western sphere, may see this as a direct threat to their own financial sovereignty. Countries with assets held in Western financial institutions might begin to question the security of their holdings, potentially triggering a shift away from dollar and euro-dominated systems. This erosion of trust could accelerate the fragmentation of the global financial order as countries seek alternative mechanisms to protect their reserves from what they perceive as arbitrary seizures. Non-aligned nations have been particularly vocal about these concerns, fearing that if the West is willing to override established legal frameworks in one case, there is no guarantee similar actions won't be taken against them in future disputes. Ethical concerns are also significant. While the West justifies seizing Russian assets as a moral imperative to fund Ukraine's recovery, critics argue that these actions blur the line between justice and opportunism. The idea of repurposing frozen funds for humanitarian or reconstruction efforts may be well-intentioned, but raises uncomfortable questions about the sanctity of ownership and the rule of law. For Western democracies that pride themselves on upholding these principles, bending or breaking the rules to achieve political goals risks substantial reputational damage. As this financial confrontation unfolds, the West finds itself at a crossroads. The decision to freeze, and potentially seize, Russian assets has exposed tensions between pragmatic policy objectives and the preservation of international norms. If mishandled, this situation could further undermine the already fragile credibility of Western institutions and alienate potential allies in the global South. The broader implications underscore the vulnerability of the current international order. While the EU and US are formidable economic powers, they must face the reality that their strategies are increasingly scrutinized and challenged by a multipolar world. The inconsistent application of policies and the gap between strong rhetoric and hesitant implementation have left them open to criticism and exploitation by adversaries. In conclusion, the freezing of Russian assets and the broader strategy of financial sanctions highlight both the power and limitations of Western economic tools. While these measures have undeniably put pressure on Moscow, they have also exposed vulnerabilities in the US and EU's approach. From risks to the dominance of the dollar to challenges in maintaining unity and credibility in a more skeptical global landscape, the West's actions, however justified in response to Russian aggression, carry significant risks. These actions could reshape the foundations of the global financial system and erode the principles it aims to defend. In this high-stakes game of economic and geopolitical maneuvering, the ultimate outcome will depend on whether the US and its allies can strike a delicate balance between asserting their influence and preserving the trust and stability that underpin the international order.